Well, blessed Wednesday to you as we come with your daily encouragement. And we are in First Peter, and we've been talking about very touchy issues of enslavement. Paul talks about it as being enslaved to sin, which we confess when we have our brief order of confession. But we are also called to be enslaved to righteousness. And so Peter and Paul, rightly or wrongly, seem to use in slavery and submission as positives as well as negatives. Of course, it's pretty obvious in some cases what the negatives of these phrases are, but let's talk about why they're used in a positive way and ways that they will be transformative through prayer and obedience before revolt and revolution, as seems to be the case in most of our political actions. Remember, Paul and Peter are not necessarily providing you great political insight on how to reorder the world. We are very thankful that slavery is not the order of the world, but servanthood is. In fact, the concept of servant leadership is very common, not just for those who are of lower ranks, but especially those of higher ranks. And that is where we get into the submission passages that we need to really consider. As I said, we start out with submitting to our section in life and then praying our way first that God will change the circumstances, getting us a different master, a different job, a different place in life. And then we might, under most extreme circumstances, if we cannot tolerate where God has placed us or where we are at with the injustices, then we might need to take that second stage and revolt. Peter and Paul don't get to that point at first. Their example, of course, is Jesus, who did not count equality with God something to be grasped, but also submitted himself in the form of a slave. See, it comes directly from the example of Jesus first, before it is reflected upon by Peter and Paul, either rightly or wrongly. It says in verse 19, "For it is a credit to you if, being aware of God, you endure pain and suffering unjustly." In fact, here is kind of where the cycle of it goes. If Jesus is God, and we assume from the scriptures that that he is God's son, and that he could have counted equality with God something to be grasped, chose to suffer unjustly. And so Christians in the early stages viewed their injustices not as something to be overcome at first, but something to be rejoicing in. Now, I need to be careful in these words. This should not be looked at as a smug thing that we, as privileged people who have never experienced some type of injustice, can point the finger at someone who is fighting for their rights and say, "You see, you're not being biblical. You're not putting out yourself in life." This is something that we each individually need to weigh out. And there are injustices that I cannot understand and that you cannot understand. And each believer needs to prayerfully consider first their situation. And in many cases, they had tried all peaceful means to right themselves before they acted. And now there's kind of an opposite tendency. There's more of a tendency to act first and then peaceably negotiate. And rightly or wrongly, I don't necessarily think that's necessarily wrong, but I don't think it necessarily follows the example of Jesus, who first looked at their circumstances, prayed for peaceful means to start, and then maybe, if God calls you by the Spirit, on behalf of others and behalf of society, to act justly. Believe me, my friends, I believe that it is important that slavery not be part of our political equation. But a person who willingly submits to true servanthood, that is another question. And that is something where we do follow the example of Jesus. He set us free from the slavery to sin, death, and the devil in order to help us how should I say, enslave ourselves to the work of justice and righteousness that God has called us to. And so we have this example once again, listen to it. For it is a credit to you if being aware of God, that God has placed you in the circumstances, and that God has placed you sometimes with a good boss and sometimes with a not so good boss. For myself as a pastor, it's always that God has placed you in a position that maybe wasn't what you were looking for, or maybe it is something that you are learning from. Now, I'm right now, I think, in a position where I'm in a position that I think God has placed me in. And it is not something that I have to go, well, I want this or I want that. No, I had to ask the Lord. And even when I was in previous positions, in some cases, wanting an out, I prayed for a circumstance that would lead me to that place. And those were heavy decisions, even when opportunities came about. Am I doing my will in God's name, or am I following God's will? These are all thorny questions, and we're just given a little bit of an insight. But we need to be aware that God is teaching us through the good and through the bad, through the times where we feel enslaved and for the times when we are free. Whether we go about it as far as switching jobs or go about it by, in a most unfortunate case, if we see rampant injustice, to take political action. Peter and Paul really do not go down that political action route, mainly because they were always going to be in the lower end of society. Even Paul, who used his Roman citizenship, knew that he was on very shaky ground and that his only consequence was to pray that God would provide him the opportunity not to escape his slavery, not to escape imprisonment. In fact, at the end of the book of Acts, he is enslaved, he is in prison, house arrest, but he's willing to freely share the word of God. And that is what we are needing to do, is to willingly put ourselves in sometimes those lesser positions, those enslaved positions, in order that the gospel may be proclaimed. And that is where we can follow the existence and the example of Jesus, who did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but took the form of a servant and followed his example. We are called to do the same. Take care. God bless. We'll go verse by verse throughout these next studies here, and I invite you to join us for your encouragement. Take care. God bless.